I'm Mr. MegaManFan. This is Genesis Does, and today we're looking at DJ Boy by Conoco. Now, when I first picked this game up, I thought, wow, that's kind of a funny title. DJ Boy. I wonder if he scratches records like a DJ. And then I dismissed that idea. But upon closer inspection, when I actually looked it up to find out the history of the game, believe it or not, it is tied to hip hop. According to the ever-reliable Wikipedia, DJ Kid was designed as a standard side-scrolling beat-em-up based partially on the hip-hop culture of U.S. cities. I'm going to agree with the partially part of that description because at no point in the game do you take a microphone, bust raps, spray graffiti on a wall, beatbox for your friends, lay down a funky track, scratch a record, none of that. But funky is not how I would describe this cartridge. It's in very good cosmetic condition, despite the case that it's in being in rather abysmal condition. No instruction manual, unfortunately. Let me turn this camera around, get it a little bit more focused on the television, pop this game in the old analog Mega SG. It's a bit of a tight fit, but I'll get it in there eventually. Power it on, grab my 8-bit do wireless controller, and of course there's just one more step. Turn on the TV, zoom in the camera, and let's play the game. Now, before I give you my own thoughts on the gameplay, I'm going to defer back to Wikipedia for a moment because without an instruction manual, I don't have much to go on other than that and the actual game itself, so I think their description is as good or better than any I could give you myself. Ahem. The premise of the home console game. A young man named Donald J. Boy, DJ Boy, is a roller fighter taking part in the ultimate fight race known as Roller Game, taking place in Cigar Tech City, located on the outskirts of New York. Many people were excited to see DJ Boy, but a roller fighting gang known as the Dark Knights want him out of the competition. Their leader, known as Heavy Met Tony, calls his gang to kidnap DJ's girlfriend Maria, who also comes to town and defeats DJ Boy. That doesn't make sense. I'm not sure the person writing this Wikipedia entry quite explained that properly, but I'll move on. DJ Boy must rescue Maria, defeat the Dark Knights, and win the roller game competition, all in one adventure. The arcade plot tells a different story. Two roller skaters named Bob and Tom were breakdancing to the beat of their boombox until it got stolen from the roller skate thieves, presumably the Dark Knights, which they must find and defeat in order to retrieve what is rightfully theirs. So it sounds like the arcade version skewed slightly closer to hip-hop music and culture than the home version, but it is what it is because this is the only version we have to play. And in fact, this is the only version, period, because Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't is the premise of this YouTube series, and it applies here because this was never released on any Nintendo platform, not even Virtual Console. This simply doesn't exist anywhere else other than Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. But a sequel exists. It's called B-Rap Boys. The game features 3-player simultaneous action, using characters that are different from one another with the optional use of weapons and vehicles, as well as a more robust fighting system. The game's soundtrack was notable for having extensively sampled studio recordings from hip-hop group 3 Stories High. Now, I wouldn't say I'm a quote-unquote hip-hop expert, but I do know a little bit about a little bit, and I've never heard of 3 Stories High. And that Wikipedia entry links to a dead page, so apparently nobody there has heard of them either. The reason you're watching the attract mode right now is while I was filming my gameplay, my cat Tango wandered downstairs, jumped into my lap, and started purring very loudly. If you listen carefully, you might even hear him, so I thought, let's let the attract mode play for a few minutes, and then I'll get back to trying my luck, seeing if I can do a little bit better than I did the first time around. But that also gives me the opportunity to give you my thoughts on DJ Boy before I start playing again. Well, I think the description side scrolling beat 'em up is accurate. It feels like a Double Dragon style game. And I would say also, more appropriately to the Sega Genesis, it would be a Streets of Rage type game. Although I believe there's Double Dragon on the Genesis. Yeah, I've got a couple of Double Dragon games. So, not entirely inappropriate to compare it to Double Dragon. Just for some reason, I think of that as more of a Nintendo franchise. I don't know where I got that idea stuck in my brain. But as you can see, it also has a test menu where you can play with the music and the sounds, change the difficulty settings, and that's really about it. The number of options are not extensive here. You've got more options on the analog Mega SG for how to make it look and sound than you've got in the actual game itself, but that's par for the course. This was the late 80s, early 90s. Speaking of which, I think that's another point I really do want to make about this game is it feels dated. I mean, this is going to be a series about retro games for the most part, except for those rare instances where somebody makes a brand new game for the Genesis like Tanglewood. But when I say it feels dated, what I mean is not specifically that it feels retro, because retro usually evokes like a feeling of nostalgia, a feeling of, hey, something cool from the past that I can still enjoy today. But this case, dated is not necessarily retro. Dated is like, okay, you've got a punch and a kick, and you can throw a punch forward and you can throw a punch backward, and you can jump. That to me just feels dated because it's like, that's all you can do. I'm not saying it's not fun, but it feels limited while you're playing it. It just makes you pine for more options, more things you can do. Like, could you do a suplex, or could you kick somebody in the balls, or could you bash them with your head, do a headbutt? You know, it's like, come on, give me a few more things I could do. And one of the things I always liked about the Double Dragon games is at least you could pick up items and use them on your opponents. You could pick up their weapons and hit them with them. You could pick up barrels or crates and throw them at people. You don't really have those kind of options in DJ Boy. So it's a little bit dated and a little bit limited. But let me get into the positives about it. The soundtrack is about par. I wouldn't call it great, but it's not grating. You can listen to it without being pained at the music that you're listening to. It's not a classic, but it's not terrible either. And the sprites are definitely large and colorful, which does a good deal of showing off the power of the 16-bit Sega Genesis at a time when it was still very new on the market. So having big, colorful sprites was definitely a plus. And as far as actually controlling your on-screen character, I can't say it's not fluid and easy to handle. Even if the move set that you can do is somewhat limited, it is responsive. When you throw the punch and kick, it's in time to your button presses, and your character moves around the screen quite naturally, even though they're giving you the illusion that he is roller skating his way through the city. Now, if I was going to nitpick, I would want to know why they decided roller skating and hip hop were so closely tied together. In my mind, that association never existed. And up until like the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years, you never really heard a lot of rappers talking about skating. I think it became in vogue somewhat in the 2000s, but I would say that had as much to do with the success of things like the X Games creating amount of crossover from that into hip hop as opposed to the other way around. But to me, skateboarding was kind of a thing. I used to skateboard when I was a kid. I was terrible, but I had my own board, and I tried to be a skateboarder, but I couldn't grind rails or do 360s or any of that cool shit. And Tony Hawk wasn't even around back then, so I didn't really have anybody to look up to as a role model for how to be a great skateboarder. I just had to literally and figuratively bust my ass trying to do things, and I was not good at it. And It lasted up until about my freshman year of college, at which point I was like, yeah, no, I'm just going to get around on a bike because I can actually pedal faster than I can skateboard, and it's much more easy to control, much less likely to get caught in a crack because the tiny wheels of skateboard will jam into the concrete, but a big bicycle tire can pretty much roll over most obstacles. So I was much happier biking around once I made the switch. But there is some part of me that still fondly remembers that ugly blue skateboard I had with the skateboarding is not a crime bumper sticker slapped onto it. And it was a secondhand board that I got through a friend, had my own set of new wheels put on it, and thought I was cool at the time. But there's no skateboarding in DJ Boy, it's just roller skating. And the parallax scrolling, if I'm going to give plaudits to this game, is pretty good. There is definitely 2 or 3 layers of movement going on when you can see the background, the foreground, and what's going on in the far distance as well. That's multiple layers of parallax here. So again, they were at least doing things that showed off the processing power of the Sega Genesis at the time compared to its 8-bit rivals, and basically forcing Nintendo to step up their own game. Competition bred greatness in the late 80s, early 90s because Sega and Nintendo going toe to toe on each other's turf created a great series of console wars and home games between Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Master System, Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, the Game Boy and the Game Gear. The list goes on and on. There is a lot of joy to be had in going back to those games because they were competing with each other to see who could be the best. So they would push the hardware to its very limits, and then when they wanted to exceed those limits, they would put additional chips inside the cartridges and basically enhance the consoles past its own capabilities just to one-up each other in this war for console supremacy. It's also a war for supremacy with this boss fight, this big woman wearing an apron who is apparently very unhappy with the skateboarders in her city. She seems to be more of a thug than the thugs I've been dealing with that have been beating me up, and I just can't get her pattern down to beat her. So I know Ryan Taylor will chime in the comments section with a few tips and tricks because he's probably played this. Why don't you do the same and give me your thoughts on DJ Boy? I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and as always, thank you for watching Genesis Does.